His hands were tied behind his back. His ankles were bound with a belt. There was a sock, probably his own socks, stuffed in his mouth, and then a shoestring, his own shoestrings, tied around that sock to keep it in his mouth. He was blindfolded, and then a shirt placed over his head. Her lower body was actually subjected to blunt force trauma. She died with her eyes open, and that was a very chilling photograph that jurors saw.
It shows how cyanotic, almost kind of purple-blue her face is because of the asphyxia, lack of oxygen.
In the sterile silence of a Knox County courtroom, a mother's worst nightmare was laid bare in excruciating detail. Dr. Darinka Malayasnik-Polchan, the chief medical examiner, held up crime scene photographs that would forever change everyone who saw them. Christopher Newsom, bound with his own shoelaces, a sock stuffed in his mouth, led barefoot to railroad tracks for execution. Channon Christian, her face a haunting shade of blue-purple from suffocation, eyes wide open in death, inside a garbage can. For 2 years, the families had wondered exactly what happened to their children during those horrific 4 days in January 2007. Now, as the prosecutor warned the packed courtroom that the testimony would be graphic and disturbing, they were about to learn the unthinkable truth about how 5 strangers had transformed their children's simple date night into one of Tennessee's most depraved torture cases.
It goes from right to left and downward. That particular bullet entered the brain and damaged the right side of the right hemisphere of the brain and then severed the brainstem. That's the injury, that was the deadly injury. That's the injury that killed Mr. Newsom.
The story that would shock the nation began innocently enough on a frigid Saturday evening, January 6, 2007, in Knoxville, Tennessee. 21-year-old Channon Gail Christian had called her mother from her boyfriend's apartment, her voice bright with the anticipation of a fun evening ahead. She and 23-year-old Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr. were planning to visit friends at Washington Ridge Apartments to celebrate a birthday and watch movies. It was the kind of simple, wholesome plan that young couples make every weekend across America. Channon was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter. Born in Powhatan, Louisiana, she had moved to Tennessee with her family in 1997 when she was just 11 years old. A senior at the University of Tennessee, she was studying to become a special education teacher, drawn to helping children who needed extra support and understanding. Her friends described her as compassionate and determined, someone who lit up a room with her genuine warmth. She had dreams of making a difference in young lives, of creating inclusive classrooms where every child could thrive. Christopher, known to friends and family as Chris, was the kind of man any father would be proud to call son-in-law. A skilled carpenter who took pride in his craftsmanship, he had played baseball in high school and maintained the athletic build and competitive spirit that had served him well on the diamond. Those who knew him spoke of his gentle nature, his quick wit, and his infectious laugh. He was the type of person who would stop to help a stranger change a tire, or spend his weekend building a wheelchair ramp for an elderly neighbor without expecting anything in return. The couple had been dating for several months, and their relationship had that special quality that made everyone around them smile. They complemented each other perfectly, Channon's academic ambitions balanced by Chris's practical skills, his steady nature providing a foundation for her dreams. Their families had embraced the relationship, seeing how happy they made each other and recognizing the genuine love that had blossomed between them. That Saturday evening, they shared dinner at a local restaurant before heading to the Washington Ridge Apartments on Chipman Street. The complex was typical of student housing in the area, affordable units that attracted young people just starting their adult lives. Channon parked her 2005 Toyota 4Runner in the parking lot, and they walked toward the apartment building, discussing their plans for the evening. Neither could have imagined that they were being watched by predators, who saw them not as human beings with hopes and dreams, but as opportunities for violence and degradation. The 5 individuals who would destroy these young lives were already known to law enforcement, a collection of career criminals whose paths had converged in Knoxville's criminal underworld. At the center was Lemericus Duval Davidson, 25, a career criminal with an extensive rap sheet, including charges for theft, drug possession, and weapons violations. Davidson was the ringleader, the one who controlled the rental house at 2316 Chipman Street that would become a house of horrors. Latalvis Darnell Cobbins, 24, was Davidson's friend from Lebanon, Tennessee, with his own history of criminal activity. George Giovanni Camus, 24, had been staying at Davidson's house and was known for his violent tendencies and complete lack of empathy for others. The only female in the group was Vanessa Lynn Coleman, just 18 years old, but already deeply embedded in their criminal lifestyle. Finally, Eric Dwayne Boyd, 34, rounded out the group with his own extensive criminal history and willingness to participate in increasingly violent crimes. What made this group particularly dangerous was not just their individual criminality, but the way they fed off each other's worst impulses. In the weeks leading up to the murders, they had been engaged in various criminal activities around Knoxville, growing bolder and more violent with each successful crime. They had developed a dynamic where each member pushed the others toward greater extremes, creating a perfect storm of sadistic violence waiting for the right victims. The carjacking occurred around 8 p.m. as Channon and Christopher walked through the apartment complex parking lot. The group approached them with guns drawn, immediately taking control of the situation with overwhelming force and intimidation. The young couple had no chance to escape or call for help, as they were forced into Channon's SUV at gunpoint. What should have been a 5-minute walk to a friend's apartment became the beginning of a multi-day nightmare that would test the limits of human cruelty. The drive to Davidson's house on Chipman Street took only minutes, but it transported the victims into a hell from which they would never return. The house itself was unremarkable, a small rental property in a working-class neighborhood where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors. Inside, however, it had become a base of operations for the group's criminal activities, complete with stolen goods, weapons, and drugs. From the moment they arrived at the house, both Christopher and Channon became victims of sustained, systematic torture that would continue for hours. The perpetrators seemed to take pleasure not just in the violence itself, but in the psychological torment of their victims. They alternated between moments of relative calm and explosive brutality, keeping their captives in a constant state of terror and preventing them from predicting what would happen next. Christopher Newsom was the first to experience the full extent of their sadism. According to the detailed testimony later provided by Knox County Acting Medical Examiner Dr. Darinka Malusnik-Polchan, Christopher was subjected to repeated sexual assaults by multiple perpetrators. The medical evidence showed he had been sodomized with objects, creating injuries that spoke to the deliberate cruelty of his attackers. These weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. They were calculated acts of dehumanization designed to strip him of dignity before taking his life. The physical restraints used on Christopher revealed the methodical nature of the torture. His hands were bound behind his back using his own shoelaces, a detail that showed how the perpetrators used whatever was available to maximize their victims' helplessness. His ankles were tied with a belt, likely his own, creating a hobbling effect that would have made any attempt at escape impossible. A sock, probably taken from his own foot, was stuffed into his mouth to muffle his cries, then secured in place with another shoelace tied around his head. The blindfold and shirt placed over Christopher's head served multiple purposes. It prevented him from seeing his attackers' faces clearly, but more importantly, it was part of the psychological torment. Being unable to see what was coming next would have heightened every sensation and made every sound a potential harbinger of fresh torment. The perpetrators understood that fear of the unknown could be just as powerful as physical pain. After hours of torture inside the house, Christopher was forced to walk barefoot to a set of railroad tracks near the Chipman Street address. The medical examiner's testimony revealed that he was shot 3 times while lying on his back, indicating that his killers had positioned him for execution rather than killing him in a struggle. The fatal bullet entered his head at an angle, traveling from right to left and downward before penetrating his brain and severing his brainstem. This was the injury that ended his life, but even death wasn't enough to satisfy his tormentors.
Right to left and downward. That particular bullet entered the brain and damaged the right side of the right hemisphere of the brain and then severed the brainstem. That's the injury, that was the deadly injury. That's the injury that killed Mr. Newsom.
His hands were tied behind his back. His ankles were bound with a belt. There was a sock, probably his own socks.
In a final act of desecration, the perpetrators set Christopher's body on fire while he lay on the railroad tracks. This wasn't just an attempt to destroy evidence, it was a continuation of their dehumanizing treatment of their victim. The fire consumed his remains, making identification more difficult and adding one final insult to the litany of horrors he had endured. While Christopher was being murdered on the railroad tracks, Channon Christian was enduring her own prolonged nightmare inside Davidson's house. The medical examiner's testimony revealed that her ordeal lasted between 12 and 24 hours, during which she was repeatedly sexually assaulted by multiple perpetrators in ways that defied comprehension. The evidence showed she was raped early in her captivity, then hours passed before she was assaulted again, indicating the systematic nature of her torture. The injuries to Channon's body told a story of escalating violence that went far beyond sexual assault. Dr. Milosnik Polchin testified that the victim had suffered what she termed blunt force trauma to her genital region, meaning she had been kicked, punched, and beaten in her most vulnerable areas. The medical evidence showed extensive hematomas, blood clots formed from severe trauma, around her anal and genital regions, indicating prolonged and repeated physical abuse. The hematomas were particularly significant because they showed the violence had been sustained over time. As the medical examiner explained, hematomas don't form immediately. They develop as blood accumulates in tissue damaged by repeated trauma. The fact that these injuries were found on both sides of Channon's body indicated she had been attacked from multiple angles and directions, suggesting coordinated assault by multiple perpetrators working together to maximize her suffering. The perpetrators' attempts to destroy DNA evidence revealed both their consciousness of guilt and their ongoing cruelty toward their victim. They poured bleach into Channon's mouth and vaginal cavity, causing chemical burns that added another layer of torment to her final hours. This wasn't just about covering their tracks, it was another form of assault, another way to inflict pain on someone who had already endured unimaginable suffering. Channon's final hours were spent in conditions that can only be described as torture. She was stuffed into a residential garbage can in Davidson's bedroom, her body contorted to fit into the confined space. The perpetrators had bound her in what investigators called a hog-tied position, with her hands and feet secured behind her back, making any movement impossible and maximizing her discomfort and terror. A white plastic grocery bag, the kind found at any Kroger store, was placed over her head as the final instrument of her murder. The medical examiner testified she would have suffocated within an hour, struggling for breath in the dark, confined space, while her face gradually turned the cyanotic blue-purple color that would horrify jurors years later. When her body was discovered, her eyes remained open, creating what Dr. Milosnik Polchin described as a drying artifact that darkened her eyes and preserved the terror of her final moments. The discovery of the crimes began when both families realized their children hadn't returned home or answered their phones. Channon's parents, Gary and Dina Christian, knew something was wrong when they couldn't reach their daughter Sunday morning. She was responsible and considerate, always letting them know her plans and checking in regularly. When repeated calls went straight to voicemail and text messages went unanswered, they knew this wasn't typical behavior for their daughter. Christopher's parents, Hugh and Mary Newsom, were equally concerned when their son failed to come home Sunday night. Chris was reliable and hardworking, someone who showed up when he said he would and kept his commitments. When he didn't appear for work Monday morning without calling in, his employer contacted the family, adding to their growing worry. Both families contacted the Knox County Sheriff's Office to file missing persons reports, providing detailed descriptions of their children and the circumstances of their disappearance. The responding officers took the reports seriously, recognizing that these were responsible young adults with no history of disappearing without explanation. The investigation began immediately, with detectives canvassing the area around Washington Ridge Apartments and interviewing residents who might have seen something suspicious. The breakthrough came on Monday, January 8, 2007, when Norfolk Southern Railway employees discovered Christopher's burned body along the railroad tracks near Chipman Street. The scene was immediately recognized as a homicide rather than an accident or suicide. The positioning of the body, the evidence of restraints, and the obvious signs of violence before death made it clear that investigators were dealing with a murder case. Detective Todd Childress of the Knox County Sheriff's Office took the lead on what was initially a single homicide investigation. Childress was a veteran investigator with experience in complex cases, but even he was unprepared for the scope of violence that would eventually be revealed. His first priority was securing the crime scene and beginning the methodical collection of evidence that would eventually help convict all 5 perpetrators. The location of Christopher's body near Chipman Street provided the first major clue about where the crimes had occurred. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood, looking for anyone who had seen or heard anything suspicious over the weekend. They also began running background checks on residents of the area, looking for individuals with criminal histories who might be capable of such violence. The investigation took on new urgency when Channon's Toyota 4Runner was found abandoned and burned in a different location. The vehicle had been discovered by Knoxville police officers, who initially treated it as a routine case of auto theft and arson. However, when the vehicle identification number was run through databases, it was immediately connected to the missing persons case, elevating the investigation to a potential double homicide. Forensic analysis of the burned SUV yielded crucial evidence despite the fire damage. DNA samples recovered from the interior of the vehicle would later be matched to several of the perpetrators, providing direct physical evidence linking them to the kidnapping. The location where the vehicle was found also provided insights into the perpetrators' movements after the crimes, helping investigators reconstruct their timeline. The breakthrough that would crack the case wide open came from an unexpected source: forensic analysis of Channon's burned Toyota 4Runner. Despite the fire damage that had been intended to destroy evidence, crime scene technicians were able to recover a crucial piece of physical evidence from inside the vehicle. Hidden among the charred debris was an envelope, and on that envelope was a single fingerprint that would change everything. When the fingerprint was run through the automated fingerprint identification system, it came back with a match to Lamarcus Duvall Davidson, a 25-year-old career criminal with an extensive rap sheet. The fingerprint placed Davidson directly inside Channon's vehicle, providing the first concrete link between a suspect and the crimes. More importantly, Davidson's last known address was listed as 2316 Chipman Street, just a short distance from where the burned SUV had been discovered and very close to where Christopher's body had been found on the railroad tracks. Armed with this crucial evidence, Detective Todd Childress and his team obtained a search warrant for Davidson's rental house on Chipman Street. The proximity to both crime scenes, combined with the fingerprint evidence placing Davidson in Channon's vehicle, gave investigators probable cause to believe they would find additional evidence at the residence. What investigators discovered when they executed the search warrant on January 9, 2007, was a crime scene that veteran detectives would later describe as the worst they had encountered in decades of police work. Channon's body was found exactly as the medical examiner would later describe in court, stuffed inside a residential garbage can in the kitchen, positioned in a way that maximized both her suffering and the perpetrator's ability to hide her body. Around the house, investigators found Channon's personal belongings, additional physical evidence linking the location to both victims, and clear signs that the residence had been used for the extended torture session. Critically, Davidson was not at the house when police executed the search warrant. His absence meant that while they had found the primary crime scene and recovered Channon's body, the investigation's most wanted suspect had escaped and was now on the run. This discovery launched an immediate manhunt for Davidson, who was now considered armed and extremely dangerous. The physical evidence inside the house painted a clear picture of what had occurred over the previous several days. Blood evidence, DNA samples, and other trace evidence connected multiple perpetrators to both victims. The house had been used for the extended torture session, with different rooms serving different purposes in the perpetrator's systematic degradation of their victims. The manhunt for Lamarcus Davidson became Knox County's top priority, as investigators realized they were dealing with someone capable of unimaginable violence who was now loose in the community. Detective Childress and his team began tracking Davidson's known associates, analyzing his phone records, and following up on any leads that might indicate where he was hiding. A crucial break in locating Davidson came from analyzing phone records that showed recent communication between Davidson and Eric Dwayne Boyd, the 34-year-old who would later be identified as involved in the initial carjacking. The phone records revealed multiple calls between the two men in the days following the murders, suggesting ongoing contact and possible coordination. When officers located and stopped Boyd for questioning, he initially denied knowing Davidson or having any involvement in the crimes. However, as investigators pressed him with evidence of the phone communications and made it clear that they had overwhelming evidence connecting Davidson to the murders, Boyd's story began to change. Realizing that his continued lies would only make his situation worse, Boyd eventually decided to cooperate with investigators. Boyd's cooperation proved invaluable in tracking down Davidson. He revealed that Davidson was hiding in a vacant house, trying to avoid the manhunt that was closing in around him. Boyd provided investigators with the specific location where Davidson could be found, leading to the planning of his arrest operation. When police surrounded and entered the vacant house where Davidson was hiding, they found him in possession of evidence that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Most significantly, Davidson was wearing some of Christopher Newsom's shoes, a chilling trophy from his victim that provided direct physical evidence linking him to Christopher's murder. Even more damning was the .22 caliber revolver found in Davidson's possession, which would later be ballistically matched to the bullets recovered from Christopher's body during the autopsy. The arrest of Davidson marked a major turning point in the investigation, as investigators now had the apparent ringleader of the group in custody, along with physical evidence directly connecting him to both victims. The shoes and gun provided compelling proof of his involvement, while the fingerprint in Channon's vehicle placed him at the scene of the kidnapping. Latalvis Cobbins was identified through his association with Davidson and witness statements placing him at the house during the relevant time period. His arrest followed quickly, and like Davidson, he initially denied participating in the crimes. However, DNA evidence recovered from both victims would later contradict his claims of innocence. George Thomas was arrested based on evidence placing him at the crime scene and witness testimony from other co-conspirators. His DNA was also found on both victims, and his fingerprints were discovered on evidence bags used during the commission of the crimes, indicating his active participation in the torture and attempted cover-up. Vanessa Coleman's arrest was initially more complex because of her age and gender. Investigators initially considered the possibility that she might have been another victim rather than a perpetrator. However, evidence soon emerged showing that she was an active and willing participant in the crimes. Her DNA was found at the crime scene, and testimony from co-defendants would later describe her role in the torture and sexual assault of the victims. Eric Boyd's connection to the crimes was established through his involvement in the initial carjacking. Witness testimony and physical evidence found in his possession linked him to the kidnapping of the victims from the apartment complex parking lot. While he wasn't present during the extended torture session at Davidson's house, his role in facilitating the initial crime made him a co-conspirator in the murders. The interrogation process revealed the cold, calculating nature of the perpetrators and their complete lack of remorse for their actions. Davidson, as the apparent leader of the group, initially attempted to deny any knowledge of the crimes, despite being the renter of the house where Channon's body was found. When confronted with overwhelming physical evidence, including DNA samples and witness testimony, he shifted to minimizing his role while attempting to blame the other co-defendants. Cobbins attempted to portray himself as a reluctant participant who was coerced into involvement by the more dominant members of the group. He claimed he was present during some of the events, but denied participating in the sexual assaults or murders. However, DNA evidence contradicted his statements, and testimony from other defendants described his enthusiastic participation in the torture of both victims. Thomas also tried to minimize his involvement, suggesting he was merely present but not an active participant. Like the others, he was confronted with DNA evidence that directly contradicted his claims. His fingerprints on evidence bags and witness testimony describing his actions during the crimes made his denials impossible to maintain. Coleman's interrogation revealed important details about the group dynamics and the extended nature of the torture. She admitted to being present during portions of the assault, but initially claimed she was coerced by the male defendants. However, evidence suggested she was an active participant who helped clean up evidence and participated in the sexual assault of the victims. Her youth and gender initially generated some sympathy, but the evidence clearly showed she was a willing participant rather than another victim. Boyd's case was somewhat different because he wasn't present during the extended torture session at Davidson's house. However, his involvement in the initial carjacking and kidnapping made him a co-conspirator in the murders under Tennessee law. His interrogation focused on his knowledge of the other defendants' intentions and his role in facilitating the crimes. The legal proceedings began in earnest with grand jury indictments handed down in 2007. All 5 defendants were charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, especially aggravated robbery, rape, and first-degree murder. The charges carried the possibility of the death penalty for the male defendants, while Coleman faced life in prison due to her age and the circumstances of her participation. The case immediately attracted national attention, partly due to the extreme brutality of the crimes, but also because of the racial dynamics involved. The victims were white, and all 5 perpetrators were black, leading to intense debate about media coverage and whether the case was receiving appropriate attention. Some argued that similar crimes with the races reversed would have generated more immediate national coverage, while others contended that the case was receiving appropriate media attention given its horrific nature. Knox County District Attorney Randy Nichols made the decision to seek the death penalty against Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, and Boyd, while Coleman would face life in prison due to her age at the time of the crimes. This decision reflected both the heinous nature of the crimes and the level of premeditation and cruelty involved in their commission. Davidson's trial began first, setting the stage for the most detailed presentation of evidence about the crimes. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorneys Takesha Fitzgerald and Leland Price, methodically built their case using DNA evidence, crime scene analysis, medical examiner testimony, and witness statements from co-defendants who had agreed to testify in exchange for plea considerations. The medical examiner's testimony became the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dr. Dorinka Malusnik-Polchin's detailed description of the injuries suffered by both victims was so graphic and disturbing that it affected everyone in the courtroom. Her professional, clinical presentation of the evidence made the horror even more impactful as she methodically documented each injury and explained its significance to the jury. The photographs presented during the medical examiner's testimony were among the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever shown in a Knox County courtroom. Despite their graphic nature, they were essential to proving the extent of torture and degradation suffered by both victims. The prosecution argued that jurors needed to see the full scope of the crimes to understand the level of depravity involved and to make appropriate sentencing decisions. The jury's reaction to the evidence was visible but controlled. A male juror flinched and covered his face when viewing photographs of Christopher's injuries, while a female juror gasped and covered her mouth when seeing images of Channon's body. However, the jurors recovered quickly and continued to pay close attention to the testimony, recognizing their responsibility to carefully consider all evidence regardless of how disturbing it might be. The defense team, led by public defenders Doug Trant and Danish Dharmapala, faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence against Davidson was overwhelming, including DNA samples, fingerprints, and witness testimony placing him at the center of the crimes. Their strategy focused on challenging the prosecution's timeline, questioning the reliability of witness testimony from co-defendants, and attempting to argue that Davidson wasn't the primary instigator of the violence. Expert witnesses called by the defense attempted to challenge various aspects of the prosecution's case, including the medical examiner's conclusions about the timeline of injuries and the DNA analysis that connected their client to the crimes. However, the physical evidence was so extensive and well documented that these challenges had little impact on the overall case. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the systematic nature of the torture and Davidson's role as the leader of the group. They argued that the crimes occurred in his house, under his control, and with his active participation. The DNA evidence, they contended, proved beyond any reasonable doubt that he had sexually assaulted both victims and participated in their murders. On August 26, 2009, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts against Lamarcus Davidson. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jury's conviction that Davidson was guilty of the most serious crimes in Tennessee law. The verdict brought tears of relief from the victims' families who had waited more than 2 years to see justice begin to be served. The sentencing phase of Davidson's trial required the jury to consider whether the crimes warranted the death penalty under Tennessee law. The prosecution presented evidence of the aggravating factors that made the case death penalty eligible, including the especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the murders, the fact that multiple victims were killed, and the commission of the murders during the course of other felonies. The defense presented mitigation evidence about David's background, including testimony about his difficult childhood and claims of mental health issues. However, the jury found that the aggravating factors far outweighed any mitigating circumstances, and Davidson was sentenced to death for the murders of both Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Cobbin's trial followed a similar pattern, with the prosecution presenting much of the same evidence that had convicted Davidson. DNA evidence placed Cobbins at the scene and showed his participation in the sexual assault of both victims. Witness testimony from other co-defendants described his active involvement in the torture and his apparent enjoyment of the victim's suffering. The jury in Cobbins' trial was equally convinced by the evidence, returning guilty verdicts on all counts and sentencing him to death. Like Davidson, Cobbins showed little emotion during the verdict and sentencing, maintaining the callous demeanor that had characterized his behavior throughout the legal proceedings. Thomas's trial resulted in guilty verdicts on all counts, but the jury chose to sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than death. While his participation in the crimes was clearly established through DNA evidence and witness testimony, the jury apparently found that he was less culpable than Davidson and Cobbins in organizing and directing the torture. Coleman's trial as an adult generated significant attention due to her age and gender. The prosecution argued that despite being only 18 at the time of the crimes, she was an active and willing participant who had opportunities to help the victims or seek assistance, but chose instead to participate in their torture. The evidence showed her DNA at the crime scene and testimony from co-defendants describing her involvement in the sexual assault of the victims. The defense argued that Coleman was coerced by the male defendants and was as much a victim as a perpetrator. They presented evidence about her troubled background and suggested that she was intimidated into participation by threats from the other defendants. However, the jury found that she was a willing participant who bore criminal responsibility for her actions. Coleman was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 53 years in prison, making her eligible for parole only after serving at least 44 years. The sentence reflected both her participation in heinous crimes and her relative youth at the time of their commission. Boyd's case was complicated by his more limited involvement in the extended torture session. He was present during the initial carjacking and kidnapping, but wasn't at Davidson's house during the prolonged assault of the victims. However, under Tennessee law, his participation in the kidnapping made him legally responsible for all crimes that flowed from that initial act, including the murders. Boyd was initially tried in federal court on carjacking charges and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Subsequently, he was tried in state court on the murder charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The dual prosecutions ensured that he would be held accountable for both his federal and state crimes.
The legal proceedings were significantly complicated by the discovery that the presiding judge in the initial trials, Richard Baumgardner, had been addicted to prescription drugs during portions of the proceedings. This revelation, which came to light several years after the initial trials, required that all defendants be granted new trials to ensure their constitutional rights had been protected. The retrials began in 2012 and continued through 2014, requiring the victims' families to relive the trauma of the crimes multiple times. However, the consistent verdicts across multiple trials demonstrated the strength of the evidence and removed any doubt about the guilt of the defendants. Davidson and Cobbins again received death sentences, while Thomas and Boyd received life sentences without parole, and Coleman received the same 53-year sentence. Throughout all the legal proceedings, the families of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom displayed remarkable strength and dignity. Gary and Dina Christian attended virtually every court hearing, often giving victim impact statements that moved seasoned court observers to tears. Their grace under unimaginable circumstances became an inspiration to others facing similar tragedies. Hugh and Mary Newsom similarly showed tremendous courage in facing their son's killers repeatedly throughout the legal process. They spoke eloquently about Christopher's life and the impact his murder had on their family while maintaining their faith in the justice system despite its lengthy delays and complications. The case had significant impacts beyond the courtroom. Law enforcement agencies across Tennessee studied the investigation to improve their procedures for handling complex torture cases. The medical examiner's office enhanced its protocols for documenting and preserving evidence in cases involving extensive physical trauma. Victim advocacy groups used the case to push for reforms in how the justice system treats families of murder victims during lengthy legal proceedings. The case also sparked ongoing debates about media coverage of interracial crimes, the application of hate crime statutes, and the effectiveness of the death penalty in deterring the most serious crimes. These broader social and legal issues continue to be discussed by scholars, activists, and policymakers seeking to understand and prevent similar tragedies. As of 2025, Davidson and Cobbins remain on Tennessee's death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, having exhausted most of their direct appeals. Both continue to file various post-conviction motions, but legal experts believe their chances of avoiding execution are minimal, given the strength of the evidence and the heinous nature of their crimes. Tennessee has resumed executions in recent years, making it likely that both will eventually face the punishment imposed by their juries. Thomas continues to serve his life sentence without the possibility of parole at a Tennessee state prison. Now in his early 40s, he will spend the remainder of his life in custody, never again able to harm innocent victims. His lack of parole eligibility ensures that he will die in prison, providing a measure of security to the community and justice for the victims' families. The case continues to serve as a reminder of the random nature of violent crime and the importance of remaining vigilant about personal safety. The fact that two young people could be abducted from a public parking lot and subjected to such horrific torture serves as a sobering reminder that evil can strike anywhere, at any time, without warning or provocation. For law enforcement, the case represents both a successful investigation that brought all perpetrators to justice and a learning opportunity for improving response to similar crimes. The thorough collection and analysis of physical evidence, combined with effective interrogation techniques and witness cooperation, created an overwhelming case that survived multiple trials and appeals. The medical examiner's role in documenting the extent of torture and providing scientific evidence about the victim's suffering was crucial to securing appropriate convictions and sentences. Dr. Milisnik Polchan's professional presentation of horrific evidence helped juries understand the full scope of the crimes without sensationalizing the victim's suffering. The case also highlights the importance of victim advocacy and family support during lengthy legal proceedings. The Christian and Newsom families' strength throughout years of trials and appeals demonstrates both their personal resilience and the importance of community support for families facing such tragedies. Nearly 18 years after that cold January evening when two young people set out to spend a simple evening with friends, the Christian Newsom case remains one of the most horrific crimes in Tennessee history. The systematic torture, sexual assault, and murder of two innocent victims by 5 callous perpetrators represents a level of evil that challenges our understanding of human nature and criminal behavior. Yet from this darkness has come light in the form of improved law enforcement procedures, enhanced victim advocacy, stronger families, and a community's determination to honor the memory of two remarkable young people. The case stands as a testament to the power of justice, the importance of never giving up in the face of evil, and the enduring strength of families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. The legacy of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom lives on not just in the legal precedents set by their case, but in the lives touched by their families' advocacy, the students helped by scholarship funds established in their names, and the community members inspired by their example to treat each day as a gift and each person as deserving of dignity and respect. Their story reminds us that while evil may triumph temporarily, justice and love ultimately prevail when good people refuse to give up, refuse to forget, and refuse to let the darkness have the final word. In a world too often marked by cruelty and indifference, the memory of Channon and Christopher serves as a beacon of hope and a call to action for all who believe in the fundamental goodness of humanity and the power of justice to heal even the deepest wounds.